Hey, Soul Stories fam. We're starting a new love journey. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now stay with us. The story begins. Manhattan's morning wore a damp, pale gray, the kind of light that made glass buildings look as though they were holding their breath. And Emma Collins was running, fast, with the fragile belief that if she could just make it into the lobby, everything would be fine. She had chosen the cream-colored dress the night before because it made her feel neat, dependable, like an adult who had her life under control. A belief that dissolved in an instant when the wheels of a glossy black sedan cut through a curbside puddle and threw the entire city onto her. Icy, dirty water splashed from her knees upward, soaking into the fabric and clinging to her skin. Emma froze, her hand trembling around her hot coffee cup, her brain needing a few beats to accept that her morning had just been ruined in the most unnecessary way possible. The car braked hard. The window rolled down. The man behind the wheel wore a dark suit, his collar crisp, hair neatly styled, his polished appearance so familiar. A face Emma swore she had seen far too often on the covers of business magazines. She waited for an apology. One word would have been enough. Instead, she got a thin, quick, cold smirk, as if what had just happened wasn't worth another second of his schedule. The window slid up. The car drove off. Emma stood for 2 more seconds on the wet sidewalk, her heart pounding hotly. Then she blurted out, loud enough for a few passers-by to turn, not directed at anyone in particular, but at the entire morning. Successful men are all the same. The words dissolved into the rain. Emma spun around and rushed into the building lobby as if moving faster might make everything behind her disappear. The coffee cup shook in her hand. The loose lid betrayed her with a small pop. Hot brown liquid spilled over, adding another helpless stain to the already soaked dress. Emma stopped, looked down, and let out a dry, humorless laugh. She pressed the elevator button. Then her phone rang. By reflex, she pulled it out. It was Lena, her best friend. She answered, and Lena's cheerful voice came through. "Hey, babe, are you at the office yet? Hope you're having a great morning." The elevator doors opened. She stepped in, and they closed. Metal met metal with a dull sound. The elevator began to rise. Emma leaned back against the wall, her breathing gradually evening out as her irritation found a rhythm. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. She had someone listening. She spoke immediately without preamble, as if continuing a conversation that had only been briefly interrupted. "All I wanted was a normal morning. I just got splashed by some luxury car right in front of the building." "Another luxury car?" Lena chuckled softly. "Let me guess. Nice suit, terrible attitude?" "Bingo." Emma shifted her weight impatiently. "A slick, successful guy who looks like he was born exempt from apologizing." As she spoke, she brushed at her dress as if she could erase the uncomfortable marks. "Seriously," she continued, her voice laced with sarcasm and fatigue, "I don't hate money. I hate the attitude that comes with it. The kind where they're always busy, always important, and everyone else is just background." "Guys like that are all the same," Emma said. "Same playbook. Expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive car, that half smile, and a look like the whole city is their private runway." "Yeah," Lena replied. "I dated one like that. He apologized to me by email." Emma let out a short, sharp laugh. "See? I told you." She exhaled. "They're in such a rush. They forget other people are human. If they bump into someone, the universe is at fault, never them." A very soft breath sounded in the confined space. Emma didn't notice. Then the elevator jerked, swayed slightly, and came to a full stop. The lights flickered. The floor indicator froze at 27. She blinked. "Wait," Emma said, her heart speeding up. "I think you're stuck?" Lena asked. "Looks like it." Emma glanced around instinctively. "It's fine. I'm fine. Just stuck in a metal box." She turned around, and all the words she had poured out over the past few minutes came rushing back at once, crashing over her like a wave of cold water. In the elevator's right corner stood a man, tall, immaculate, wearing a tailored dark gray suit that fit like it had been custom made. The fluorescent lights reflected off his wrist, where a minimalist watch caught the light in a subtle way. He stood there with an almost unbelievable calm, as if being suspended midair was nothing more than a minor delay in his day. Emma finished her sentence on a broken breath, to a stranger, and pulled the phone away from her ear. "Lena," she said quickly, "I'll call you back." She hung up. The air in the elevator thickened. Emma could clearly feel her heartbeat, the hot surge of embarrassment flooding her face. "I'm sorry," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the phone. "I didn't know anyone else was in here." The man raised his eyebrows very slightly. "Elevators are usually shared," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying no judgment. That somehow felt stranger than being scolded. Emma swallowed and folded her arms to steady herself. The lights flickered once more, then steadied. The silence magnified every small movement. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Emma replied too quickly, then corrected herself. "I mean, just annoyed." He nodded as if annoyance were a perfectly reasonable response. The gesture only made her more aware of what she had just said. The expensive suit, the familiar posture of someone used to making decisions, the excessive composure. "What do you do?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He tilted his head, considering. "I run a company." Each word landed with its own weight. Emma felt her stomach sink. "Oh," she said. A pause stretched, forcing her to continue in a lower voice. "Is it big?" "Quite." She closed her eyes for half a second, then opened them, taking a deep breath. Everything suddenly aligned with merciless clarity. "So," Emma said slowly, "you just heard my phone conversation." "Almost all of it," he replied. "Even the part," she trailed off. "Slick, successful men are all the same," he supplied calmly. Emma made a tiny sound, not quite a word. "I want to disappear." "You don't have to," he said. He'd heard her. "You were talking to your friend. You didn't insult anyone directly." "But you're the subject." "True." He smiled very thinly, not defensive, not mocking, as if he were observing something interesting rather than feeling offended. The elevator vibrated, then began moving again with a soft mechanical hum. The man reached out and pressed the button for 23. Emma startled when he said her name. "Emma, you know my name?" He gestured downward to the employee badge, wet and swinging against her chest. "Hard to miss." The doors opened. A brightly lit hallway appeared. Emma stepped out, her head still spinning, her dress still soaked, her pride smeared like the street outside. Just before the doors closed, he spoke his name. "Alexander Reed." She turned back. "You were right," he continued, his voice low and warm. "Not every successful man apologizes when he should." A pause, just long enough for the words to settle. "I'm sorry," he added, "about the car this morning." The elevator doors slid shut behind Emma, leaving her standing alone in the bright hallway, her heart still out of rhythm. The embarrassment came late but unmistakably, burning at her cheeks and the back of her neck. Not because someone had overheard her, but because she had let her irritation turn into easy judgments. She knew the man driving the car that morning hadn't been Alexander Reed, but that didn't make anything lighter. He had stood there listening, calm and kinder than she'd expected, and that very kindness made her want to vanish all the more. Emma straightened her badge, took a deep breath, and started walking. Inside, she carried only one small wish, almost a silent prayer, that she would never have to see that man again. Emma Collins stepped into the conference room with the distinct feeling that everyone was looking at her dress before looking at her. The faded stain from that morning wasn't dark anymore, but it also wasn't light enough to disappear. It sat there like a deliberate reminder, right under the cold white lights, making each of her footsteps sound louder than usual. She chose a seat near the end of the table, pulled out the chair as quietly as possible, set down her documents, and tried to breathe like a perfectly normal person, preparing for a perfectly normal meeting. It didn't work. Across the table, chairs were still being filled. Soft whispers, paper rustling, pens tapping against the surface. Emma looked down at her slides, even though she practically knew them by heart, just to give her eyes something to do. She thought of the elevator, of the name, of the tiny, sincere hope that the man from this morning would not show up today. The door opened. Emma didn't have to look up to sense the shift in the room. Conversations faltered half a beat. A few people straightened their posture, and a quiet, focused attention rippled outward. When she finally had no choice but to raise her head, the first thing she noticed was the familiar gray suit. Not because it was special, but because she'd seen it far too close, far too clearly, in a completely different place. Alexander Reed walked into the conference room as if it already belonged to him. Not hurried, not ostentatious. He nodded at familiar faces, shook a few hands, his smile thin and polite. When his gaze reached Emma, her heart skipped, then sped up, not because of anything he did, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't look surprised, didn't frown, didn't reveal even the slightest hint that their elevator encounter existed anywhere beyond their memories. Introductions began. Business cards were exchanged, titles announced. Alexander Reed, CEO of Reed Holdings, your company's new partner. The sentence landed in Emma's mind like a clear knock to the forehead. She had suspected, or at least braced herself for the possibility, but hearing it said aloud was different. She felt herself shrink into her chair, the dress with its faint stains suddenly transforming into a giant billboard hanging across her chest, screaming, "I wasn't ready for today." The meeting unfolded exactly as planned. Emma delivered her part with a steady voice, her breathing so controlled she surprised even herself. She knew she did well. This was her job, and here in this space she was always reliable. But every time she paused between slides, she felt Alexander Reed's gaze. Not intrusive, not judgmental. It was the gaze of someone who knew a little story no one else in the room was aware of. When she finished, the room held a brief silence before approving nods and proper compliments appeared. Alexander spoke last. "Clear presentation," he said, "and very practical." That was all. No more, no less. Emma bowed her head in thanks, though heat rushed to her cheeks, not because of the compliment, but because of how he said it. Calm, courteous, and entirely detached from the chaos of that morning. It should have been a relief. Instead, it unsettled her. The rest of the day passed like a series of awkward social misfires. By the coffee area, Emma stood too close to the machine. In another elevator, she stood too far from the doors. When coworkers asked if she was okay, she answered faster than necessary. Everything felt slightly off, as though the world had shifted a few degrees and she hadn't adjusted yet. They saw each other twice more. Once in the hallway where Alexander stepped aside to let her pass, offering a small nod and no words. Once near another elevator, a different elevator, where he stood next to her for a few silent seconds. The comfortable quiet somehow more disconcerting than any strained small talk. Late in the afternoon, when the conference room was empty, Emma stayed behind to tidy up. She gathered the papers slowly, as if dragging out time might make the day dissolve on its own. When the door opened again, she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Emma!" His voice was low and close, but not intrusive. She turned, heart lurching. "Yes," she replied. Alexander stood a few steps away, phone in hand, his suit still immaculate, untouched by the length of the day. He observed her for a beat before speaking, gently, almost as though he were asking permission. "I just wanted to say, this morning didn't affect the meeting." She blinked, unsure whether this was reassurance or a perfectly crafted courtesy. "Thank you," Emma said. "I apologize if—" "No need," he cut in, that thin, familiar smile appearing. "Everyone has bad mornings." He paused, then added as though he weighed the words carefully. "And that stain," he glanced at her dress, quick, discreet, "doesn't make you any less professional." She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Good to know." Alexander nodded, stepping back half a pace, giving her space. Before turning away, he looked at her once more, his eyes holding something closer to shared understanding than curiosity. "When you walked into the room," he said, "I knew I was holding a very interesting secret." The door closed behind him. Emma stood still, her hand resting on the edge of the table. The morning's embarrassment had given way to something harder to name, a warm, reluctant fluster mixed with the dawning realization that this story, whether she wanted it or not, had begun in its very own peculiar way. The meeting took place late in the morning, inside a glass-walled room overlooking a crowded avenue, where sunlight reflected off the polished wooden table, making everything appear sharper and colder than usual. Emma Collins arrived a few minutes early, set down her laptop, and reviewed the project documents with nearly obsessive care. After yesterday, she had grown used to the feeling of walking a thin wire. Everything was fine until someone suddenly yanked one end. The executive team filtered into their seats, a few familiar faces from the client side, a few new ones. Alexander Reed sat at the head of the table, leaning slightly forward, his hands resting comfortably, looking more like an observer than the one in charge. His presence created a very specific kind of quiet order, not imposed, but one that made every word carefully weighed before being spoken. The project update began smoothly. Emma presented the progress, what had been completed, and the milestones still awaiting confirmation. She kept her voice steady, her gaze calm, and for a brief moment, she thought the meeting might actually end on time, without any additional complications. Then came the risk assessment. "There is one issue," Mark said, his voice slightly louder than necessary as he rotated a pen between his fingers. Mark was the partner-side project manager, always courteous on the surface, but Emma had enough experience to recognize his sense of timing. "We've just received feedback that the communications component is behind schedule. As far as I understand, that falls under Emma's team's responsibility." Emma blinked, just once. She glanced down at the documents, then back at him. "The communications component is on track," she said evenly. "If you're referring to the final version content, we're still awaiting approval of the changes from your side." Mark smiled lightly, a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps," he said, "but the executive board is concerned with final outcomes. And right now, what they're seeing is a delay." The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. Several glances flicked toward Emma, and then away, and a few pens were quietly set down. It was a familiar moment when responsibility began to slide away from the person holding it, searching for another surface that was easier to stick to. Emma felt heat creep up the back of her neck, but she didn't show it. She had been in rooms like this long enough to know that the first reaction was always the most important. "The issue isn't execution," Emma said clearly. "It's the last-minute scope change." "We're not here to debate technical details," Mark cut in. "What I'm saying is that your department needs to take responsibility for the delay." A silence dropped, heavy and brief, as if the entire room were waiting to see how Emma would handle it. At the head of the table, Alexander Reed remained silent. He wasn't leaning back, nor was he looking at any documents. His gaze rested directly on Mark, not hostile, but steady enough to make it clear he was paying attention. "Excuse me," Alexander said, his low, even voice cutting in before the air could thicken further. "I'd like to clarify one point." Mark turned to him, momentarily surprised by the intervention, but quickly regained his polite smile. "We reviewed the timeline again this morning," Alexander continued, not looking at the screen, as though he already had everything clearly in mind. "The email confirming the scope change was sent from your side 3 days ago, and the update from Emma's team was responded to within 24 hours, exactly as agreed." He paused, letting the statement carry its own weight. "If there is a delay," Alexander went on, "it originates from the change decision, not from execution." No one spoke for several seconds. Mark blinked, his lips pressing together. "I'm simply speaking from a risk management perspective," he replied. "We need—" "Your perspective has been noted," Alexander said politely but firmly. "But responsibility needs to be placed correctly. Misplaced blame doesn't move the project forward." The sentence wasn't loud or sharp, but it landed on the table like a weight that couldn't be ignored. One board member nodded. Another flipped through the documents, confirming the timeline. The discussion shifted direction, smoothly and decisively, leaving Mark quieter than before. Emma sat there, her hands tucked beneath the table so no one could see them, gently curling into fists. She didn't look at Alexander right away. She knew that if she did, whatever crossed her face might not belong in an executive meeting. She focused on breathing, on keeping her own rhythm, while a sense of disorientation rose up, mixed with a relief she couldn't quite articulate. The meeting ended earlier than expected. People stood, chairs slid back, small conversations formed in clusters. Emma packed up slowly, her movements more deliberate than usual. When she looked up, Alexander was standing near the window, exchanging a brief word with another executive. He nodded, said a final sentence, then turned toward her. "Emma," he called. She stepped closer, her heart beating a little faster. "Thank you," she said frankly, without pretense. "But why did you help me?" The question escaped before she could weigh it. There was no suspicion in her tone, just genuine confusion. In the professional world, interventions like that usually came with another motive. Emma had learned that lesson the hard way. Alexander looked at her for a moment, as if the answer were obvious to him, even if it wasn't to her. His gaze was calm, carrying no personal favoritism or expectation. "I don't like unfairness," he said. "That's all." She blinked, waiting for more. There was none. "That's the only reason?" Emma asked. "It's a sufficient one," he replied. There was no drama in how he said it, as if he were referring to a basic principle, something everyone should have, but not everyone upheld. And in a very quiet way, that made Emma feel better than any apology or public praise could have. Alexander stepped back half a pace, maintaining a professional distance. "If you need any data to support your team in future meetings," he said, "let me know." "Yes," Emma replied, "I will." He nodded once and turned away, leaving Emma standing in the gradually empty conference room, sunlight slanting through the glass. She stood there for a few more seconds, allowing herself to fully register what had just happened. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't favoritism. It was simply someone choosing to stand on the right side and choosing to do so even when no one had asked. Emma took a deep breath and slipped her laptop into her bag. As she walked out of the room, she realized something simple but significant. The disorientation she'd felt earlier was no longer just embarrassment. It had turned into a quiet respect, and though she wasn't ready to admit it yet, a very new sense of safety, just enough to let her know she wouldn't be forgetting this meeting anytime soon. The cafe sat on a street corner, too small to be considered stylish, yet always filled with the scent of freshly roasted espresso and a warm golden light that made the whole world seem to slow down for a beat. Emma Collins came here whenever she needed to breathe, small enough that no one paid attention to her, quiet enough for her to sort through the chaos of her thoughts. She settled at the table by the window, pulled her laptop closer, and placed her cappuccino to the right. Steam rose, fogging the corner of the glass and creating a soft, private cocoon. Emma closed her eyes for a second, as if the morning meeting had been nothing more than a passing dream, leaving no trace behind. But every memory of it was still there, buried beneath caffeine and forced concentration. When she opened her eyes, movement outside caught her attention first. A tall figure, unhurried, stepped steadily. The cafe door chimed open, and Emma's glance flicked up on instinct. Her heart stalled. Alexander Reed walked in, carrying the city's afternoon light along the line of his gray suit jacket, his expression calm as though midday was the quietest part of his schedule. He didn't look around for anyone. He ordered something she couldn't hear. But then, like an invisible thread tugging his attention, his gaze shifted to her. The moment was brief, but long enough for Emma to want to crawl under the table. She straightened her posture, smoothed her hair, adjusted her collar. Small, pointless gestures her instincts insisted on performing, as if survival depended on them. Alexander approached her table, a cup of hot black coffee in hand. "Emma." He spoke her name in a low, smooth voice, not bothering to ask whether she wanted this encounter. "Hi," she replied, trying to keep her tone casual. "You come here often?" "First time." He glanced around. "This place seems calm." "I like that." Emma gave a faint smile. "Then you'll be disappointed. At 3 o'clock, kids from the school next door rush in for pastries. Then I should enjoy the peace before it disappears." A polite pause followed, the kind that suggested he was waiting to see if she wanted him to stay. She felt that awareness, and that quiet respect was precisely what made her invite him without feeling intruded upon. "If you're not busy, you can sit." Alexander pulled out the chair across from her. Somehow the room tightened by 2 beats. Emma stared at her coffee for courage. She knew she had to address this. Even if she wished, she didn't. "I need to apologize," she began, tracing the rim of her cup. About the elevator. Alexander leaned back slightly, his dark eyes softening with attentive interest. I really didn't think anyone else was in there, Emma continued. I said things I shouldn't have, and I regret it. He didn't respond right away. He watched her, not the invasive kind of watching that unsettles people, but the kind that tries to understand without judgment. It was a silence that made breathing easier. Then he smiled, thin but genuine. Emma, he said, I thought you were honest. She tilted her head, surprised. Honest to the point of being rude? No, he shook his head. Honest in a way most people aren't brave enough to be. You didn't say those things to attack anyone. You were just being yourself. A subtle pressure eased in her chest, as if she'd relaxed a part of herself she hadn't noticed was tense. It was the first time in her life she'd seen a CEO, or anyone with real power, not react with defensiveness, condescension, or the classic I know better tone. You're really not angry, she asked. If I got angry every time someone had something negative to say about successful men, he replied, voice dropping slightly, I'd never have time to do my actual job. She let out a soft laugh, the sound slipping free like a breath. Alexander observed her for a moment, his gaze capturing not the surface details, but the emotion she was trying to keep tucked away. Emma rested her chin on her hand, half shy, half curious. I've never met a CEO like you. What kind, he asked. The kind who doesn't judge people, she said. The kind who doesn't use power to create distance. Alexander glanced down at his coffee, rotating the cup gently between his fingers. I think real power, he said, is making people feel like they don't have to defend themselves. It took Emma a few seconds to process that. The words were simple, but beautiful. In a strange way, they made her want to believe him. Maybe, she said softly, I was wrong about some things. Maybe. Alexander lifted his gaze, and when their eyes met, the moment held a stillness that stretched time. But you were wrong for understandable reasons. Her chest loosened even more, warmth replacing tension, coaxing her guard lower than she intended. Either way, she said, thank you for being patient with me. Not patient, he corrected. Fair. Emma smiled, a real smile, unforced, unguarded. Outside the window, the afternoon sun angled through the awning, brushing a streak of gold across the table. An ordinary sight, yet something in her world had shifted. No drama, no spotlight, just a chance conversation in a small cafe. But for the first time, Emma realized Alexander Reed was nothing like the idea she had attached to successful men. And that, one small, offbeat detail, was enough to make her heartbeat change, just slightly, but enough for her to know this wasn't over. The shared workspace had been temporarily set up in a meeting room far smaller than what Emma was used to, a room wedged tightly between two rows of glass offices, where light filtered in through narrow slits, and the hum of the air conditioning whispered without pause. The reason was practical enough. The client needed to be closely involved for 3 critical days, but the result was that Emma and Alexander Reed were placed back in the same box. This time it wasn't an elevator, but it wasn't any more spacious. Emma set her laptop on the table and slid her chair back just enough to keep her knees from bumping the edge. She had told herself all morning that this was just work, that they had already talked at the cafe, already apologized, already laughed, and now everything should return to where it belonged. That belief held steady for exactly 5 minutes, until Alexander closed the door behind him, and the sound sealed both the room and her safe distance. We have 30 minutes before the tech team comes back, he said, opening the file folder. Where would you like to start? With the part you think I'll defend to the end, Emma replied without looking up, and that you'll try to trim down. Alexander let out a soft laugh. You think I like cutting things? I think you like efficiency, and you like impact. Emma looked up, pressing her lips together before smiling. Call it even. That was how the discussion began. Light, sharp, a chain of questions and answers that suddenly filled the small room with energy. They leaned over the same project plan, heads closer than necessary, to read a small figure, then pulled apart then moved closer again. Each time Emma sped up, Alexander slowed to listen. Each time he veered toward risk mitigation, Emma pulled the conversation back toward the human experience. They weren't arguing to win, they were arguing to clarify. "This part is too safe," Emma said, tapping the screen lightly. "Safe avoids delays," Alexander replied. "Safe makes people doze off. Dozing off is better than being angry." Emma tilted her head. "Are you afraid of people being angry?" Alexander considered for a second. "I'm afraid of people being left behind." The sentence wasn't loud or philosophical. It landed between them, brief, precise, enough to make Emma stop tapping her keyboard. She looked at him, trying to find a layer of armor behind the words, but found only a straightforwardness that seemed habitual. No performance. No need to impress. The door cracked open. A technician stuck his head in, saying he needed to check the wiring. He stepped inside, bringing with him the cold scent of metal and the soft slap of his shoes on the floor. The already narrow space felt even tighter. Emma stepped back instinctively and realized Alexander had moved back faster. Without saying a word, he positioned himself between her and the technician, a very small, very natural gesture, as if his body was accustomed to taking that place. He asked a few questions about timing, about noise levels, about whether they needed to step out. When the technician answered and began working, Alexander stayed where he was, half a shoulder angled toward Emma, leaving her enough space that she didn't need to retreat further. Emma watched it all in silence. No pointed glance. No performative move that says, "I'm protecting you." Just pure reflex, stepping where it was necessary at the right moment. The technician left. The door closed. Alexander turned back, completely normal. "Let's continue," he said. Emma nodded, but her rhythm had shifted. She needed a few seconds to return to the work, to remember that they were here for a project, not for the small gestures that had just taken place, as though they weren't worth noticing. But it was precisely that lack of significance that made them linger. The work session stretched into lunchtime. The light in the room changed, sliding from warm gold to pale white. They shifted positions, changed seats, and shared a power outlet. In a rare, awkward moment, Emma bent down to pick up some papers, and her head nearly brushed his shoulder. Alexander leaned away just slightly. No contact, but close enough for Emma to catch the scent of coffee and something warm and familiar she couldn't quite name. "Do you always do that?" Emma asked, not looking at him. "Do what?" "Step in," she said. "Create space for other people." Alexander slowly set the stack of papers down. "A habit," he answered. "Not everyone likes tight spaces." Emma nodded, smiling faintly. "Neither do I. But you handle them pretty well." "Because I have a choice," she said. "That makes it different." He looked at her, his gaze softening by half a beat. "Yes." They finished the last part just as the noise outside increased. When Emma stood to pack up, she realized she felt less tense than when she'd entered the room. The room wasn't any bigger, but she was different. She had grown accustomed to his presence, not in a way that made her dependent, but in a way that reassured her that if someone came too close, he would step between without hesitation. Out in the hallway, the flow of people was more chaotic. Someone in a hurry nearly collided with Emma. Alexander placed a hand on the back of the chair just in front of her, keeping her exactly where she was while the crowd surged past. Another small gesture. Again, without a word. "Thank you," Emma said once things had settled. Alexander shrugged. "It's nothing." But as they walked side by side, she realized that what unsettled her wasn't the protection. It was how he did it, like a natural reflex without demanding credit, without turning her into someone who needed shielding. He protected her space without occupying it. And in tight spaces, where people often reveal the roughest edges of themselves, Emma saw in Alexander Reed something rare and gentle, strength that knew how to step back at the right moment. That thought followed her all the way to the elevator doors, another elevator, when she realized with an unexpected smile tugging at the corner of her mouth that this was the quietest and sweetest kind of chemistry of all. The feeling of being safe without being placed in anyone's shadow. The site inspection took place late in the afternoon when the sunlight had dropped lower and the city began shifting colors, less harsh than during the day. They walked through the proposed event space. An old building renovated with high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and a scent of metal mingled with fresh paint. The place was still empty, their footsteps echoing, private enough that words wouldn't get swallowed whole. Emma held a tablet, jotting down notes, pausing now and then to measure distances and observe the light. Alexander walked half a step behind her, quietly matching her pace. They spent the walk talking about entrances, guest flow, and how to avoid bottlenecks, familiar topics, safe ones. But beneath everything, a different kind of silence lingered, waiting for the right moment to surface. It came when they stopped in the lobby corner, where a large window opened toward the street. Sunlight angled in, hitting the glass and stretching long streaks of brightness across the concrete floor. Emma stood there for a moment, saying nothing, then exhaled a small, self-soothing laugh before speaking. "There's a reason," she said, voice perfectly steady, "why I react so strongly to those successful man types." Alexander didn't turn right away. He set his folder down carefully, let it rest, then looked at her, not urging, not prying, just present. "My ex," Emma continued, "was one of them, very smart, very busy, and always certain he was a step ahead of me." She paused, looking out at the street as though the story lived somewhere in the passing traffic below. Alexander remained silent. No interruptions, no overly sympathetic nods. "When we started," she said, "I thought I was lucky. He told me I was intelligent, creative, the only one who understood his pressure. I felt chosen." She gave a small laugh, one without joy. "But over time, everything turned into little comparisons," she went on. "My work was nice, just not important. My flexible schedule allowed me to wait. My ideas were interesting, but needed someone with vision to decide." Emma inhaled, fingers tightening around the tablet. "I started apologizing for things that didn't deserve apologies," she said. "Sorry for asking questions. Sorry for needing time. Sorry for not keeping up with the pace he set without asking if I wanted it." Alexander didn't move. His gaze stayed on her, neither sharp nor soft, simply steady. "One time," Emma said, "I got promoted. Nothing huge, but it mattered to me. I called him before I even called my parents." She lifted a shoulder. He was silent for a few seconds and then asked if it would affect his schedule. The room was wide and empty, yet it felt as if she were speaking from a confined corner. She didn't cry. She had replayed this story in her mind too many times for tears to keep up. "I stayed longer than I should have," she said, "not because I believed he would change, but because I believed if I tried a little harder, he would see me differently." She turned toward Alexander, for the first time since she began. "Maybe I was wrong." Alexander held her gaze. He didn't contradict her. He didn't soften the truth. He let it stand, sharp edges intact between them. "What happened after?" he asked. Just one question, quiet and timely. "I left," Emma said, "but the feeling of losing stayed longer. It made me uncomfortable every time I saw men like him. When I watched them walk into a room, certain the world would rearrange itself around them." She stopped. Silence settled, never heavy, just enough for her last words to land where they belonged. Alexander stood still for a moment, as though weighing something carefully, not phrasing, but meaning. Then he spoke, his voice low, not loud. "You didn't fail." Emma opened her mouth, instinctively ready to argue, but he continued, not rushing, not overpowering her. "He did." 3 words, precise, no explanations, no sugarcoating, no empty wisdom. Emma blinked, not out of surprise, but because she suddenly saw another way to interpret those years, one that didn't place the weight solely on her shoulders. She drew a deep breath, something easing inside her chest. "You're not going to tell me to let go or forgive, are you?" she asked, half joking. Alexander shook his head. "Not everything needs advice," he said. "Sometimes all you need is someone to name what really happened." Emma nodded. Outside, the light had changed, softer, warmer. She looked down at her tablet, then put it away, as if the inspection's most important task had already been completed, without another note. When they left the lobby, their footsteps sounded lighter than when they entered. Emma realized that scar, the one she thought she had hidden well, no longer stung the same way. It was still there, part of her story. But for the first time, it didn't define her as someone left behind. Beside her, Alexander kept pace. Not ahead, not behind. And in that easy, respectful silence, Emma understood that listening, truly listening, was sometimes the deepest form of protection one person could offer another. The partner meeting took place late in the afternoon, at a high-rise lounge overlooking a city turning honey-colored with the fading light. The music was just loud enough to fill the gaps, the tables arranged slightly closer than was comfortable, making private conversations inconveniently exposed. Emma arrived early, chose a seat by the glass railing, set her bag down, and opened her laptop. Slipping into her familiar work mindset helped her avoid thinking about why Alexander was in meetings on a different floor today. The partner's name was Ryan. He introduced himself as someone who liked to work fast and efficiently. He arrived right on time, shook hands firmly, smiled brightly, and let his gaze linger in places it didn't need to. From the very first minute, he angled his chair a little closer, lowered his voice a little more, and laughed a little too precisely beyond the boundaries of professionalism. "Emma," Ryan said, looking at her over the rim of his glass, "you look completely different outside the conference room. Less serious." Emma smiled politely, maintaining her safe distance with 2 layers of words and the edge of the table between them. "We're here to discuss the rollout milestone," she said, pulling up the slides. "Which section would you like to start with?" Ryan smiled and nodded, as if her answer were a light-hearted joke. "I like the way you steer a conversation," he said. "I think we work very well together." Emma acknowledged the comment with a neutral nod. She was used to it, half-formed boundaries wrapped in compliments. She moved on to timelines, risks, and budgets. Ryan listened, but every time she paused to take a sip of water, his eyes drifted back to her wrist, her hair, the restrained curve of her smile. "Do you have plans after work?" he asked as she closed her laptop. Emma prepared the courteous reply she'd used hundreds of times, vague, noncommittal, neither inviting nor explicitly rejecting. She opened her mouth. "Emma!" The familiar voice arrived, low, calm, cutting in just enough to avoid rudeness. Alexander stood there, jacket draped over his arm, as if he'd simply happened to pass by. But the position he chose, slightly angled between Ryan and her, was anything but accidental. "Sorry I'm late," Alexander said, his gaze brushing over Ryan with a beat of polite acknowledgement. "The meeting ran long." Ryan stood to shake his hand, his smile unchanged but his confidence dimmed by a notch. "Ryan," Alexander replied, nodding, "we still need to align on the interface." "Of course," Ryan said, turning back to Emma. "We can talk more when you're free." Alexander said nothing. He simply rested a hand on the glass railing beside Emma, close enough to draw a new boundary, far enough not to intrude. Emma noticed her breathing slow automatically, a small physical adjustment as the space rearranged itself into something right again. They exchanged a few more work-related comments. Ryan began checking his watch more often, smiling less. When he left, the farewell was polite, leaving no residue behind. Emma closed her laptop and let her shoulders relax. "You showed up at just the right moment," she said lightly, half teasing. Alexander tilted his head. "I thought you needed to discuss the interface." "Yeah," Emma laughed softly, "and the spatial arrangement." He looked at her for a beat, his gaze inquisitive, but not pressing. "He was pushing the boundary a little," she added plainly. "Nothing extreme, just enough to make me want to leave sooner." Alexander nodded as if logging useful information rather than evaluating a feeling. They stepped out of the lounge, into a longer, narrower hallway as foot traffic thickened. For a moment, Ryan turned back as if to say something more. But seeing Alexander walking beside Emma, his pace slowed, then he veered away. "Am I imagining it?" Emma said quietly as they waited for the elevator. "Or are you always nearby when it's needed?" Alexander gave a slight shrug. "This building is smaller than it looks," he replied. The elevator doors opened. Inside, it was more crowded than usual. Someone in a rush nearly bumped into Emma. Alexander turned quickly, placing his shoulder between them. A mumbled apology followed, and then silence returned. No possessive glance, no heroic flourish, just the right position taken at the right moment. When the elevator stopped at her floor, Emma stepped out first. The hallway was quiet, white light making everything sharper than necessary. She turned back. Alexander. Yes. Thank you, she said. Not just for today. He looked at her, his gaze steady and gentle. If he makes you uncomfortable, Alexander said, his voice low, not softened, I want to know. Not a warning, not a claim of authority, just a statement that placed her safety first, leaving room for her choice to remain exactly where it belonged. Emma nodded, warmth spreading slowly, without drama. I'll tell you, she replied. The elevator doors closed behind Alexander. Emma stood still for another second, realizing that what made her smile wasn't the jealousy itself, but the way it had arrived, quietly, respectfully, like a soft period placed at the end of a long day. Their project had finally reached the finishing stage, the part where everything suddenly sped up. Smaller teams sprinted toward deadlines, and end-of-day emails began to include, "Great job, everyone." Emma left the office late, laptop in her arms, hair slightly undone after a long day. When she reached the elevators, she saw Alexander exiting a conference room across the hall, undoing the top button of his suit jacket, looking tired yet relaxed. Same timing, Emma said, smiling a little. Seems so, Alexander replied, pressing the elevator button. The doors opened. They stepped inside. Everything was perfectly normal, until it wasn't. 3 floors in, the elevator lurched, then stopped. The lights flickered twice, exactly the kind of apology only elevators know how to deliver. Emma let out a quiet laugh. No way. A third time would officially qualify as a pattern. Alexander tilted his head at the ceiling, as if negotiating with fate. I'm convinced this elevator needs therapy. Silence fell, though this time it wasn't awkward. It felt like an invitation, something soft, warm, charged, and not meant to be interrupted. Emma leaned against the wall, one leg casually crossed, her gaze on him far more comfortably than before. This time, she said, half teasing, half warning, I'm not going to badmouth you. Alexander turned toward her, the corner of his mouth lifting into a smile that made her heart skip. Emma, he said quietly, even if you did, I'd still be here. The way he said it wasn't a challenge, not even teasing. It sounded like permission, like he accepted every difficult edge she had. Emma looked at him. Alexander looked back. The space between them suddenly felt much smaller than she remembered. 1 second, 2 seconds. Neither moved, but the entire cabin seemed to lean toward them. Emma swallowed. Are you always this dependable? Alexander stepped half a pace closer, small but enough for their breaths to mingle. Only with one person? Emma's breathing slowed. Her hand found the wall rail for balance, but Alexander placed his palm on the panel near her shoulder, not touching her, yet enclosing her in a space that felt impossibly warm and steady. Their eyes locked. The moment stretched. Softer. Closer. Alexander's gaze dipped to her lips, unhidden. Emma felt herself leaning in, as if her body had decided for her. Alexander lowered his head, closing the last inches between them. Emma's eyes fluttered shut, the kiss just a heartbeat away when... Clang! The elevator jolted violently, then shot upward as if nothing had ever happened. They sprang apart like someone had yanked invisible collars from behind. Emma straightened, hand over her mouth to keep from laughing too loudly. Her face was burning. Alexander clearly needed a moment to recalibrate. He folded his arms and cleared his throat like a man who definitely had not almost kissed a colleague 3 seconds ago. Well, the elevator appears to be operational again, he said, voice impeccably formal, impeccably CEO, impeccably I wasn't about to do anything inappropriate. Emma grinned, eyes curved like an afternoon sunbeam. Yes, I noticed. When the doors opened on her floor, Emma stepped out, then turned back. Alexander? He lifted his gaze. That thing just now, she said, voice softer but unmistakably clear. If the elevator hadn't started moving. Alexander raised a finger, a gentle shush, his smile slow and warm. Emma, we can't argue with elevators. The doors slid shut, but not before she caught that smile. One that didn't say not now, but rather I'll wait for the right now. Emma stood alone in the hallway, face flushed, heart pounding, and a sweetness blooming right in the center of her chest. It was indeed the second elevator incident, but the first time she genuinely wished the elevator hadn't fixed itself quite so fast. Emma had thought the worst was over once the contract was signed. The official announcement went smoothly. The press ran positive coverage of the new strategy, and her name appeared neatly in the credits, lead representative for the winning bid. No one said it out loud, but in the industry everyone understood. Every finished race left someone behind as a loser. Emma just hadn't expected one of them to choose this approach. That evening, she left the final meeting later than planned. The city lights were already on. The building lobby where the announcement event had taken place was still busy, but traffic was thinning. Emma paused by the glass doors to request a ride, one arm hugging her document folder, her mind finally beginning to loosen after weeks of strain. "Miss Collins!" The voice made her heart drop a beat. Emma turned around. The man stood a few steps away, wearing a worn coat, his face gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. She recognized him instantly, even though it had been nearly a month since they'd last faced each other in a conference room, the primary competitor in the recent bid. "The results have already been announced," Emma said, keeping her voice calm. "If you need, don't pretend to be polite," he cut in. "You know who I am, and you know why I'm here." He stepped closer. Instantly, Emma sensed something wrong. This wasn't a business conversation. "I have nothing to discuss privately," she said. "Everything is over." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Over?" he repeated. "You call my company shutting down over?" Emma tightened her grip on the bag strap. "I'm not responsible for your company's financial situation," she said. "The bidding process was transparent." "Transparent?" he sneered. "Have you forgotten that lunch at the Ellison Hotel?" The blood in Emma's veins turned cold. She hadn't forgotten. She never could. That afternoon, he had sat across from her, smiling pleasantly, then slid a number across the table on a slip of paper. A number large enough to buy silence. Emma had pushed it back, stood up, and walked away without another word. "I was very clear," Emma said. "I don't compromise, and I don't take your money." "And you think that makes you moral," he growled. "I think that's why hundreds of people are out of work." He stepped closer. Too close. "The truth is, your company had problems long before the bid," Emma said, even as her heart began to race. "No one goes bankrupt over losing a single contract." His eyes darkened. "You always think you're smarter than everyone else," he said quietly. "You think playing fair makes you innocent?" His hand snapped around Emma's wrist. The grip was sudden and crushing, hard enough to tear a cry from her throat as her documents fell to the floor. "Let go of me!" "No," he snarled. "You're going to look at me and understand what you've done." Emma struggled, but he was stronger, his grip tightening. Panic surged up, primal, beyond the reach of the logic she usually relied on. "You're hurting me?" "You should have thought about that before slamming every door in my face." Fear exploded. Emma tried to scream. "Let go!" The voice came from behind them, so cold that the air itself seemed to freeze. Alexander Reed stood several meters away, having just stepped into the lobby. He didn't need to ask what was happening. One look at Emma's trapped wrist and her ashen face was enough. The man turned. "This is none of your—" Alexander moved forward, not fast, not rushed, but each step made it clear that a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be stepped back from. "I'll say this one last time," Alex said, his voice low and blade sharp. "Take your hand off her." The grip loosened almost reflexively. The moment Emma's wrist was freed, Alexander pulled her toward him, placing her behind his back before she could even catch her breath. "You lost the contract," Alexander said, his gaze unwavering. "But you ruined yourself with your own decisions. Don't pin that failure on anyone else." "She's the representative," the man shouted. "And she did her job correctly," Alex replied. "As for you, you've just made the worst mistake of your life." Alexander took out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said. "Or you leave, right now." There was no room to bargain, no honorable exit. The man looked at Emma, then at Alex, and finally turned away. stumbling off like someone who had truly lost everything. The lobby fell silent again. All that remained was the chaotic pounding of Emma's heart and her ragged breathing. Alexander turned to her. "Emma," he said, his voice completely changed. "Look at me." And in that moment, every defense she had collapsed. She stepped toward him, shaking, then couldn't stay standing any longer. She broke down as her forehead pressed into his chest, her hands clutching his jacket like someone who had just survived something catastrophic. Alexander wrapped his arms around her immediately. No hesitation, no pause. His hold closed firmly, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other bracing her back, shielding her from a world that had just become far more frightening than she'd ever imagined. "It's okay now," he whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong." Emma sobbed. I refused him. I didn't think." "I know," Alexander said, his voice deep and steady. "And I'm proud of you for doing the right thing." She cried in his arms, tears soaking into his shirt, every last trace of fear finally finding a place to dissolve. Alexander stood there, holding her tightly, as if letting go would allow the world to reach for her again. And in that moment, Emma understood, with perfect clarity, some battles aren't won with money or power, but by refusing to bow. And some people arrive at exactly the right time not to save us, but to stay when we fall. The night stretched on much longer than Emma expected. After the other man left, Alex remained beside her, one hand lightly on her back, as if making sure she was still here, still breathing, not collapsing under the weight of what had just happened. "Let me walk you outside," Alex said quietly. Emma didn't protest. She couldn't speak anyway. Her breath was still shaking, as though her body hadn't realized yet that the danger was gone. They stepped through the revolving door. The night wind hit her face, cold, but clearer than anything she'd tried to use to steady herself. "Sit," Alex said, pointing to a small stone step near the entrance. Emma obeyed, hands clasped so tight her knuckles turned white. Alex stood for a moment, unsure whether he should sit close. In the end, he chose a distance that was exact, respectful, yet protective. Neither spoke for almost a full minute. The city before them glowed like a distorted galaxy. Cars streaming by, distant horns, familiar sounds that somehow felt hollow tonight, leaving an uncomfortable void right in the middle of Emma's chest. She swallowed, struggling to form words. "I'm sorry that you saw that." Alex tilted his head. "Emma," he said softly, "you didn't do anything wrong. There's nothing to apologize for." She lowered her gaze, voice thin as a thread. "I'm supposed to be strong. I should have said something, done something. But when he—" Her voice cracked. Her hands trembled. Alex looked at them for a moment before he reached out, touching the back of her hand slowly, almost asking permission. "There are moments," he said, "when being strong isn't the answer." Emma lifted her head. She tried to smile, but her lips only quivered. "Then what is?" "Letting someone stand where you can't." The sentence was simple, calm, not dramatic, but it hit the deepest place inside Emma, the part that believed loving someone, needing someone, relying on someone, was always a mistake. She turned her head away, but Alex didn't let her escape. He spoke slowly, each word laid down with certainty. "Emma." She turned back because of the way he said her name, as if calling her out of a place she didn't know she'd gone into. "I didn't step in because I'm strong," Alex said. Emma's eyes widened. "I'm strong," he continued, "because I choose to protect you. No roses. No, I like you. No candlelight. Just a confession, bare and unembellished, from a man who didn't need theatrics to tell the truth." Emma felt her throat tighten. A tear fell before she realized she was crying. "Why me?" she asked, voice trembling, as though the answer might rewrite her entire world. Alex met her gaze directly. No hesitation, no humor, no softened edges. "Because when you stand in front of me," he said, "I can't look away. I never want to see you shaking like you did tonight. And I won't let anyone touch you like that again." Emma broke, not sobbing but tears streaming too fast for her to catch. Alex reached out but stopped halfway. "May I?" he asked quietly, giving her the choice. Emma nodded. He cupped her cheeks, wiping her tears with slow, impossibly gentle movements. No cliché comfort. No, you're okay now. Just his unwavering presence. I was so scared, she whispered, voice fractured. I thought no one would come. I came, Alex replied, and I'll keep coming if you need me. He didn't say it loudly. He didn't need to. The words cracked through the walls Emma had built for years, walls she'd mistaken for strength. She grabbed his wrist as if verifying he was real. I'm not used to anyone taking my side, Emma said, breath trembling. I always thought I could handle everything alone. You don't have to handle everything forever, Alex answered, voice low and soft as the night. Not when you're not alone anymore. Emma lowered her head. A small sob escaped her. Alex didn't pull her into his arms, not yet. He waited until Emma leaned toward him on her own, searching for something to hold on to. When her forehead touched his shoulder, Alex finally wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close with the kind of quiet promise that doesn't need words. No theatrics, no soundtrack. Just two people on a cold stone step, beneath a blazing city, sharing a confession that didn't waste a single extra syllable. I choose to protect you. Emma cried a little longer, but this time, not out of fear. This time because for the first time in a very long time, she didn't have to stand alone. The project concluded with a concise review session, polished, professional, and quietly brilliant. The numbers exceeded forecasts, market feedback was clear, and the final handshake between both sides carried the weight of mutual respect. Emma left the conference room with a rare feeling, lightness and pride, unrestrained. She knew she had walked this entire path on her own merit, through uncompromising choices, by standing firm in the hardest moments. A few days later, the promotion came as a natural continuation. No surprise, no fanfare, but enough to make her heart tremble. The new office was brighter, the responsibilities heavier, and the trust placed in her clearer than ever. Emma accepted, closed the door behind her, and paused for a breath. Recognition touching her lightly, yet deeply. Alex returned to his own rhythm. The project was truly over. Each of them now had different meetings, different goals. But in the midst of busy days, a message arrived. No drama, no detours. I'd like to invite you to dinner, just to celebrate, if you're willing. Emma smiled as she read it. She replied. That evening, Alex met Emma at a small rooftop tucked into an older neighborhood, where the warm yellow lights were kept just dim enough for people to see one another without hiding. The space wasn't crowded. The night breeze carried the scent of toasted bread and herbs. Below them, the city glowed slowly, like a body breathing at rest. On the table were 2 glasses of white wine, a chilled bottle of sparkling water, a plate of steaming mushroom pasta, a warm salad placed in the center to share, and a small slice of tiramisu neatly cut, unpretentious. Emma sat down, took it in at a glance, and smiled softly. This is your idea of a celebration dinner? Alex looked at her, his gaze calm but gentler than usual. I thought you'd like it. They ate slowly, talking about the past few days, about returning to their separate projects, about the rhythm of life ahead. No one mentioned business between the two companies anymore. The project had ended cleanly. No loose ends, no lingering tension. And because of that, this moment finally had room for honesty. When the last plate was pushed aside, Alex set his utensils down first. He didn't rush. He looked at Emma as if checking whether now was the right moment to say something he had held on to for a long time. Emma, she looked up. I want to say this without any work-related reason. Emma didn't speak. She simply nodded. Alex took a deep breath and spoke slowly, each word clear. I noticed you that morning in the elevator. Emma paused. Not because of the situation, he continued, but because of how you reacted. You were direct. You didn't pretend. And you didn't step back in the face of power. He paused for a beat. I liked you from that moment. Emma felt her heart fall out of rhythm, but she didn't interrupt. I chose to stay silent, Alex went on, because I wanted the work to be respected. I didn't want my presence to cause people to misunderstand you or to overshadow anything you achieved by your own ability. He met her eyes. But those feelings didn't go away. Alex placed his hand on the tabletop, not touching her. I love you, Emma. No emphasis. No evasion. I'm not here to intrude on your life, he said. I want to walk beside you, to be your partner, and to protect you, not because I'm stronger, but because I choose to. The layers of defense in Emma collapsed very quietly. Tears surfaced before she could understand why. She lifted a hand to her mouth, her breath turning unsteady. I always thought, she said, her voice breaking, that being recognized would be enough. Alex didn't answer right away. But now, Emma continued, I realize I want to be seen. I want someone to love me when I'm standing strong and when I'm exhausted. Tears slid down her cheeks. I never thought I'd be loved like this. Alex rose slowly, walked around the table, and stopped in front of her. He didn't touch her immediately. May I? Emma nodded. He cupped her face with both hands, warm and steady, and wiped her tears with slow movements, as if afraid of breaking the fragile emotion unfolding between them. She cried then, without restraint, all the tension falling away with her broken breaths. Alex pulled her into his arms, saying nothing more, simply holding her there, where she no longer needed to stand on her own. Emma lifted her head first, her forehead resting against his. I want you to stay, she whispered, not because I'm weak, but because I choose it. Alex didn't answer with words. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss wasn't rushed, not possessive. Their mouths met warm and unhurried, like a promise spoken through presence. The city behind them stayed bright. The night breeze continued to move. But Emma felt only that breath, safe, steady, and real. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest, her lashes still damp. There were no roses that night, no music. But for the first time in her life, Emma knew with certainty that she was loved, recognized, and chosen properly. Their love didn't bloom with lavish evenings or grand gestures. It grew in the smallest of moments, when Emma brought Alex coffee during his late-night work hours, when Alex drove across town just to take her out for hot noodles after a tiring day, when they sat side by side in the mornings, each typing on their own laptop, yet somehow breathing in the same quiet rhythm. Sometimes Emma would walk into Alex's office and find him standing before a whiteboard filled with notes, brow furrowed over some complex issue. She wouldn't say a word, just hand him a new marker. Alex would turn, smile lightly. I needed that, he'd say. I know, Emma would reply. And that was enough. A year passed like that, softly, quietly, demanding nothing, simply accumulating itself like water-shaping stone without anyone noticing. Emma's fears faded bit by bit, not because Alex dismissed them, but because he stayed, patient, steady. The empty spaces inside Alex filled slowly, not through dependence, but through the calm Emma always carried with her whenever she entered a room. The ring appeared on an afternoon that seemed like any other. Alex asked Emma to meet him at the park where they took their weekend walks. Autumn brushed lightly over the trees, the air cool enough that standing close didn't feel awkward at all. Emma held a cup of hot cocoa, steam fogging her fingers for a moment before fading. They walked down their usual path, past children tossing dry leaves at each other, their laughter echoing into the open sky. Alex didn't talk much that day. He walked beside her with that familiar silence, one that wasn't heavy, but felt like a warm roof over both of them. And when they reached the wooden bench under the same tree as always, Alex stopped. Emma, he called. She turned, a few strands of hair blowing across her face in the wind. What is it? Alex drew a breath, as if pulling courage into his lungs. Not because he feared rejection, but because he wanted to say this perfectly. That day in the elevator, he said, you insulted me without missing a word. Emma flushed, covering her mouth with her hand. I'll apologize again if needed. Alex shook his head. No need. That was the first time I saw the real you. Honest, unfiltered, untamed. He looked at her, eyes gentle but deep. You didn't trust me that day. He paused. But today, I want to ask you something different. Alex slipped his hand into his coat pocket and took out a small velvet box. Emma froze, the cocoa cup suddenly weightless in her hand. He opened the box but didn't kneel. Yet. He wanted the words to arrive first. I love you, Emma. From that raw truth in the elevator to your strength. I love the way you stand firm. And I love the moments when you can't hide your fear. Tears gathered in Emma's lashes. Alex went down on one knee. Slow, certain, breathtaking. That day you didn't believe me, he said softly. Today, do you? Emma covered her mouth, tears falling before she could stop them. I do. Her voice trembled, but every word was sure. And I choose you. Alex closed his eyes for a brief second, as if silently thanking the universe. He slid the ring onto her finger, a slender gold band, simple and elegant, as though it had always known exactly where it belonged. Emma didn't wait another heartbeat. She pulled Alex up, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed him. A long, warm, deep kiss overflowing with everything they had held back for a year. The wind swept around them, leaves drifting to the grass. But Emma felt only Alex's breath and the rush of his heartbeat beneath her hand. When they finally parted, Emma rested her forehead against his, whispering clearly, I choose you, in every ordinary day, in every small thing. Alex cupped her cheek and smiled, and I will choose you, for a lifetime.